This is part of the Sea Change webinars we've been doing. I'm the project manager. I'm Alexis Knob. You probably saw my email address, which is how you got here. And we've been featuring some webinars for people to get excited about all sorts of change work they can do in their departments, all sorts of cool stuff you can implement. Hope if you're interested in learning about sea change, you should email me. I'll put my email address in the chat. And I would love to talk about the departmental awards. But in any case, we'll get started with the talk for today. We're featuring Pearl Sandick and Ramón Barthelemy from the University of Utah to talk to us about changing in the grad program. And the way things will work is they'll be talking. I believe you're set up to do all the good shared screen stuff, and we'll be taking questions. You should chat them to all the panelists. I will select the Q&A, and I will read them aloud. Depending on how many questions there are, we may not get through all of them, so hopefully that's okay with everyone. And so yeah, we'll get started. Ramón or Pearl, who's going to start first?
Okay, so I think I have shared the right screen with you all. So you should be seeing my title slide right now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about graduate program reforms at the University of Utah. And this is work that's been going on for a while, although a bulk of the changes happened in a really fast period of time. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. The reforms are pretty substantial, and Ramón, Jordan Girton, and I, along with an excellent postdoctoral scholar, Mackenzie Lenz, are in the process of studying the impacts of the reforms as well on the students and faculty. So today, my part is going to be summarizing the motivations behind the changes, the timeline, and the goals of the new program. And then Ramón is going to take over to tell you more about how we're studying the change itself and the impacts of the new program. And I just want to remind everyone, you probably saw it in the email, but there is a content warning for death by suicide for the first 15 to 20 minutes of the talk. All right, so let's get started. There we go. Okay, so the motivations for change. The Department in Physics and Astronomy at the University of Utah implemented an extremely comprehensive overhaul of the graduate program. And again, this was a very short timeline, about 1.5 years for most of the changes. And they were motivated by a number of really long-standing issues that we had been talking about and thinking about for a long time, but they went largely unaddressed until a really tragic event made it clear that we needed to do better. So first of all, we were operating under a pretty outdated curriculum, and that curriculum did not serve the needs of our students or support departmental research areas in the way that a really thoughtful curriculum could have, and in the way that a more modern curriculum could. So that was something that we wanted to address, especially as the department's research interests have sort of shifted over the last few decades. There was insufficient tracking of students. So at any given moment, if you looked at our graduate program, it was not totally clear how many students we had in our graduate program or exactly what they were doing. And I think that's an unfortunately common thing, but it's also something that's really easy to address. And so we wanted to make sure that we built that into a new program structure, that we knew who our students were and what they're doing. There had been a lack of attention to long-term trends, and that included problematic advising and mentoring practices, issues with lab culture and safety. Really, it sort of ran the gamut. And again, I think that a lot of these motivations are things that are present in a lot of departments. And once you start thinking about it, you find ways that we can all be doing better. Like many departments across the country, there was a lack of support for student wellness and a lack of understanding of how to handle mental health issues and make sure that our students are well and know what to do when issues arrive. So that was something that we definitely needed to address. We had been thinking about cohort building and community among students for a long time. And so one of the motivations that sort of cuts across a lot of the changes that we made was thinking about how to build in those cohort experiences and community, not only among students, but also among those who most closely support them. So in our department, that's the director of graduate studies. We have a graduate coordinator that's a staff position that interacts with the graduate students very closely, and basically all of the people that have close touch points with the students. We had what some people would view as ineffective and in some cases inequitable exam requirements For graduate comprehensive exams or qualifying exams, exams in a lot of departments. I know that this is a subject of discussion a lot of places. We had been discussing it for a long time, but there wasn't a consensus on how to move forward. And this was something that we knew we could improve. We also had an unfortunately widespread practice of violating some department policies that we knew existed. So there were like policies that you should take seriously and then policies you shouldn't take seriously. And that, that's just really not a recipe for a good outcome. And lastly, there were a lot of structural and procedural issues, especially for international students. Now, some of those were outside the control of our department because we have a lot of those are under the control of like our graduate school, which is its own college within the university, or the International Student and Scholar Services. So this wasn't something that was completely in our control, but we knew that we could build into our program checks to make sure that things didn't sort of slide under the radar or like, fall off the map for us. So and this is part of tracking students also, but from a more structural perspective, like what can we do to make sure that we're supporting these students and that we're giving them everything that they need. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history. So let's see. The history begins a little bit longer ago, but I'm going to start it in a very specific place, which is, which is in October of 2017. In October of 2017, we had a student death by suicide. And this was a real turning point for our department because, in many ways, we all felt the tragedy very deeply. And, I think at this point, the motivations for change, many of them became more clear to a vast majority, if not everyone. And we had a lot of department meetings about everything, discussing things that were very personal. The tenor of our department meetings changed at that moment. Now, when there is a tragedy like that, there are a lot of factors at play, but we all could identify things that we could have done better. So although it wasn't the first time that this was clear to some of us, the fraction of faculty who were now willing to accept that changes needed to be made increased really dramatically at this particular moment. For the next 6 months, until about March 2018, there were a number of changes that happened and decisions that were made that were outside of our department's control, in addition to things that happened within our department. So part of that was that our upper administration commissioned an external evaluation of our department that was specifically related to this student's death. In March 2018, that external evaluation was, the parts that were public were made public. And so a lot of things started to happen right around March. So we were given an external department chair. So this is Peter Trappa, who was from the math department. He's now the College of Science dean. There was the establishment of an oversight committee. So basically any policy implementation, any changes, any major decisions had to be approved by not only people within our department, but also an oversight committee that included people from our upper administration, the dean, people from the graduate school. So that really, with very, very frequent reports and interactions with the oversight committee, that helped keep a lot of these things on track. There was also a pause in our graduate program admissions. So the problems, let's see. So the pause in our graduate program admissions was something that was controversial to many, obviously, because that has a big effect on the number of students in your program, the research that you can do. But also it was felt by a lot of people that we needed that time to be able to really make the kind of changes and implement them in a way that was going to be efficient, right? The thinking was that if you let this stretch out over years, we're going to revert to the status quo. And finally, so this was a period beginning in March 2018 where the grad program reforms proceeded rapidly and with broad support, and I'll tell you about that a little bit more later. So through this period, for the next approximately year, was when a lot of the work was done. And then in March 2019, we were given permission by the Oversight Committee to admit a limited number of graduate students for the fall 2019 cohort. And so this was permission that was explicitly granted by the Oversight Committee, because until that point, it was, and it still in many ways is out of our control whether or not we have permission to admit. We have to continually demonstrate to ourselves and to the Oversight Committee that, we're running a responsible program. So let me tell you a little bit about the timeline of changes. Now I mentioned, I mentioned 2017 as a starting point, but there was actually a lot going on before that. So I'm going to roll the timeline back a little bit. And I would say that things really started to pick up in August of 2014. So in August of 2014, we implemented a new orientation for incoming graduate students. And this was work that was done primarily by Jordan Girton, and I contributed as well as another former faculty member, Brian Somm. And the point of the new orientation for graduate students, previously there had been a little bit of TA orientation or TA training that was part of their experience right when they arrived, but we really wanted to focus a little bit more on cohort development and department orientation to make sure that they were set up to like jump right into their work. The next, oh, that's interesting. So by fall 2015, that was when work began on the new advising policy. And the new advising policy was prompted by my experience and those of several of my colleagues with students who were experiencing conflicts with their advisors. Normal thing in a large department, but we knew that there were things we could identify that could be done to sort of help that. And so the goal here was that students would interact more regularly with more of their committee members to prevent things that would be like small resolvable conflicts from becoming really big problems. So that began in fall of 2015, but it took a long time for that to be implemented by the department. So in January 2016, sort of along those same lines, an ombuds committee was formed. And this was a committee that could serve students, faculty, and staff in the department in order to provide assistance with like informal conflict resolution and identifying concerning trends so that department leadership was aware of things that were happening. Because I think previously one of the issues was that there was not really great communication about these things. In March of 2017, the advising day was adopted as a department policy. And so this was where graduate students meet with at least 3 of their committee members at least once per semester. So this is a lot more advising than committee members are used to doing. Previously, it was sort of just the student and their research advisor, and then every few years, they would see the rest of their committee members, usually not between their oral exam and their thesis defense, for example. But we wanted to make sure that students felt supported by all of their committee members and that all of their committee members knew what was going on. So that was March of 2017. By summer and fall of 2017, we had also begun work on the graduate curriculum, like reforming the graduate curriculum to modernize it. These were conversations that were underway for a long time, but we just, in that summer, we formed a committee and started work to think about what a more modern program would look like. And then in October 2017 was when the student died. And that was definitely a tragedy that brought us together, a mandate for change from ourselves and from our upper administration. And it also sort of in my opinion, as someone who like lived through it and was very closely connected to how this all began, it was the moment when there was the buy-in to make things happen quickly that many of us had been thinking about for a long time. So that's sort of that was my perspective on what happened at that moment. In December of 2017, we updated the graduate advising implementation and held our first real advising day. So advising day is a day when this all has to happen, when all of the student advising has to happen. And at first we thought it's fine if everyone meets with their committee once per semester and then just reports that they did it. But what we found was that people were meeting with their committees as part of an oral exam, for example. And when students are having an oral exam, they're not talking about the things that we want them to talk about on advising day, namely checking in about not only status and milestones, but also administrative issues, coursework, all of these other things that you want to talk about separately from celebrating an accomplishment like an oral exam. So we decided to separate those, and we also coupled it with a department-wide discussion of every single graduate student. So a department-wide debrief after advising day. In January 2018, the first draft of the new graduate program was presented to the faculty and to our graduate students. And so this was really the core of it, that was like the curriculum and the degree requirements. That's one aspect of the changes that we made. And so that's when we began discussions on that in January 2018. Throughout spring 2018 was when the external review happened and when our pause in graduate admissions was announced. And that was also the point where we got the new department chair and established the oversight committee. That summer, we had a lot of changes to the program. We had a lot of personnel changes in particular. So we got a new graduate coordinator, a new director of graduate studies, and we established the graduate program committee, which now, all of these positions came with explicit charges and duties, which, before it had been sort of like an overarching keep your eye on things. And now we have, we established explicit charges for those committees. In August 2018, our new graduate handbook was approved by unanimous faculty vote. And this is really the document that specifies all of our programs. So curriculum, milestones, all of our procedures and policies are detailed in the graduate handbook. And that's available on the physics department website if you're curious. And in March 2019, we've got our approval to accept students to enter for the fall 2019 cohort. And in August 2019, we welcomed our first cohort under the new program of 13 incoming first-year graduate students. So what are the goals of the new program? You could kind of tell from the motivations, but our goals were to prepare students for success in graduate school, in academic research, and in their preferred careers, which includes careers beyond academia. We wanted to enhance equity and increase inclusivity and diversity. And this is sort of spread throughout the program in terms of recruiting, admissions, department culture, the curriculum itself, and how students are assessed in their progress. We wanted to identify and address issues quickly. I mentioned this before, so that small resolvable problems don't become big unresolvable problems. And so this, these could be issues in research. How do I get this lab equipment functioning? All the way to professional relationships, lab culture, issues that students might be having with being teaching assistants or other teaching duties, administrative issues, and everything. And that could extend to personal issues as well, depending on what students are comfortable bringing to their committees. We wanted to standardize the timeline for milestones. This was a part of our department policy that people had been sort of in a habit of not adhering to. And so making sure that students got timely feedback about their progress and that they were on track for milestone completions on a standardized timeline. Coupled with that is ensuring deliberate and fair assessment. I think there was a lot of confusion about what the purpose of our exams were prior to, it's something we had discussed again and again and again, but there wasn't 100% agreement on it. And so having our new program be really deliberate about what we were assessing and making sure it's done in a fair way. And finally, creating a master's or exit path that prepares students for what comes next. There will be students for whom a PhD is not the right path for them. And so we wanted to make sure that there's a flexible exit path and that they have time to prepare themselves for the next career stage and that they have the resources to help identify what that would be for them. So everything in this program was really, because we did it in one fell swoop, it's very intentional. Like we had the ability to think about things from all aspects at once and make sure that all the aspects of the program work together. So in terms of recruiting, that meant having a particular budget for it, making sure recruiting was targeted, that there was participation not only from a recruitment committee, but broad participation across the college. We also, we have an REU program, and so effectively interfacing with the REU program, as well as like SACNAS, NSBP, the Conference for Undergraduate Women in Physics, all of these places. And one critical piece that had been overlooked for a long time was actually updating our webpage, which is an ongoing challenge, but is, that's your public face for students who don't know about your department. And so that's included in our recruiting strategy. In terms of admissions, we went to a pretty holistic application review process. And so this was something that we designed following best practices from the NSF Includes projects, which includes iGen, which is the Inclusive Graduate Education Network. The Council of Graduate Schools also has a holistic admissions practices, they have guidelines and recommendations. And then the APS Bridge program has implemented some inclusive holistic application review procedures, and we were able to take stuff from all of those. I will say that as far as iGen, the Inclusive Graduate Education Network, is a great resource. This was just getting going as we were designing our new program. And so we used a lot of the motivating literature for that collaboration, as well as past research done by some of the hub directors and members of that collaboration. So people like Julie Posselt, Casey Miller, Geraldine Cochran, and others. Orientation and TA training were another critical piece. So we had updated this in 2014, but there were things that we could do better. So we further expanded to include enhanced cohort development and more general success strategies. So beyond just how to be a TA, but more along the lines of how to succeed in graduate school and balance all these things that you're just learning. We also focused more on what resources are available across campus. Those include wellness resources and things that are outside of our department. And then the other piece that was new was we had continued development activities throughout the semester. So rather than it just being an orientation that starts and ends the week before the fall semester, now there are sort of check-ins and there are group activities and cohort activities throughout the academic year. Advising and student support is a really big one. So I've talked some about these mandatory semester checkpoint meetings, which we call advising day, that are followed by the faculty-wide discussion of all student cases. This also included really, there was a lot of personnel, a lot of updates to personnel, and then updated and defined roles and responsibilities for all of these different aspects of the department, which included the graduate program committee, our graduate student advisory council, which is a group of graduate students that serves as a liaison between students and faculty. So empowering them and making sure that their organizational structure was functioning. They hold town halls and sponsor social events and things like that. And as well as the ombuds committee, making sure the ombuds committee has a clear charge and that they're able to carry out their duties and effectively interface with department leadership. And then there's the curriculum. So the last two are curriculum and exams. The curriculum, we now have 4 tracks to support active research areas in the department. These tracks are streamlined to be less burdensome in terms of like core or foundational courses and allow a quicker path to degree, basically, that is effective in giving students the knowledge that they need to be successful in our modern program today. So they have a strong first semester cohort experience. There are two new classes, which are a faculty research overview in their first semester and a professional development course. That's that FRO and PDC, which the professional development course is taken in their third semester. And then the other piece of that is realistic and firm timeline and milestones. And that leads me to exams, which is the last piece. And so we wanted to offer a purposeful, timely assessment. These assessments happen in the first and fifth semesters for the graduate students. And they're, sort of included in that are options for a graceful and productive exit. The other aspect of just sort of from a practical perspective on implementing the reforms to the exam structure was we wanted to make sure that options for accommodations were clear and it was straightforward how to implement accommodations for students who needed them. So that is all I'm going to say on this. Moving forward, the goals are to study the genesis and impact of the new policies, and this is NSF-supported research. Ramón is the PI of this grant, and Jordan Gerton and I are also on it, and we have an excellent postdoc, Mackenzie Lenz, and support from Alexis as well. So I will let Ramón take over from here.
Great. So I joined the department in about May of 2019 as the first physics education research faculty. So I joined up when these changes were well on their way and had already been implemented. And one of our colleagues, Jordan Gerton, was interested in doing a more formal study on the project and asked me if I would PI and write a grant to the physics directive on the study. So we went ahead and submitted the grant very soon after I was here. And we're lucky enough to get the funding to actually formally study the change process that happened in the department. And today I'll share with you a little bit about that as well as some of the preliminary results. Pearl, could you unshare your screen because it won't let me. Okay. There you go. Yeah, it won't let me share until you do that. Thank you. So broadly, this NSF study was looking to answer some research questions in 2 areas. And the 2 areas are looking at the students that are experiencing all these new policies, and then trying to understand how the change actually happened in the department, who the change makers or the change agents were, and then what were some of the challenges to actually implementing this change. So as I go through this portion of the talk, I'll talk about the methodology, the analysis processes, and then I'll also go through some of the preliminary results on these research questions. Of course, the study is ongoing. We took a constructivist grounded theory lens, a constructivist grounded theory approach with a standpoint theory lens. So essentially that means is this was an iterative process, and we came to it understanding that we were influenced by the literature, that we were influenced by our own understandings of the program, which makes it constructivist. The standpoint theory part comes in that we really wanted to express the changes in student experiences of these new policies from their lived experiences. So we wanted to put an emphasis on what did they say, what were their experiences, and less on what our individual research or interpretations were. So this informed the data collection, which was all in-depth interviews that are based around prompts with the change makers and agents, and also the students experiencing the change. All of the data is coded by 2 researchers line by line to build up a code book. And then this same code book is then being used to go through all of the interviews to analyze them. And I think one thing to talk about in this methodology is the barriers that we have put in place of who actually has access to the data and how it's being interpreted. Because me as a PI, I was not here during any of the transition process, but I am here now, and I'm colleagues with all the faculty that are being interviewed. Jordan and Pearl were very intertwined and integrated with the changes that are happening in the department, and have known all these people, you know, in some cases for more than a decade. So we've put layers in place about who actually has access to the data. So the only person that actually had access to the interview data and actually knows who did each faculty interview is the postdoctoral scholar, Dr. Mackenzie Lenz. Dr. Alexis Knob last year actually came and did our first batch of student interviews before we had hired the awesome postdoc that works in our group. But Alexis and Mackenzie are doing a lot of the analysis together, and then that analysis in aggregate is presented to me as the PI, in which I can help interpret and understand it. And then the final write-up of that will then be presented to Jordan and Pearl. So there are these multiple layers that are separating people that are most intertwined in the department to the actual data. And the only person who actually knows what transcripts go to which person is the postdoctoral scholar, Dr. Lenz. So all in all, we have conducted 32 interviews, 26 of which are with faculty and legacy students and administrators, and 6 of which are with the first cohort of students, in addition to 1 written response. We had 1 participant who wanted to write out the response. We have roughly 10 to 20 more interviews to go. These will all be with students. So we're going to interview the first cohort of students for a second time, which will be very interesting because they will have went through all their opportunities to continue in the PhD program, as well as transitioning to virtual learning. And then we'll also be doing an interview with the second cohort of students, and that whole cohort of students is currently virtual, as one can safely assume. I will not give direct numbers as to how many faculty, students, admin, and staff we interviewed, because again, ensuring anonymity is tough in this project because we are looking at an individual department, but I will share that in order of magnitude, of the 32 interviews conducted, the majority were faculty, followed by students, legacy, and the new cohort. Legacy just meaning they went under the previous graduate policies, followed by administration in the university. So these are people that were deans and chairs at the time, or in other associate dean positions, as well as staff. All of the interviews were audio recorded, transcribed verbatim, and then anonymously aggregated by Dr. Lenz. And then, as I said before, the final analysis is presented to me. I do help interpret the final aggregate analysis, but the final write-up will be presented to the co-PIs, Jordan and Pearl, who will have less of a say in the analysis, actually mostly not a say in the analysis, because of their positionality within the department during these changes. And I have to say, Dr. Lenz and the support by Dr. Knob have been critical in ensuring some validity in the research process and ensuring that we are a step removed as a faculty from the process. So looking at the first question, how were students experiencing the new components of the graduate program? So this comes from interviews with roughly half of the first cohort. We're going to try to interview everybody again in January, as well as the other 7 people that we didn't interview the first time around. So what we found is it was actually quite uneven. So it really depended on the component of the program. So although the TA orientation was incredibly helpful and everybody had really positive experiences being a TA almost without exception, we found that the comprehensive exam was still a barrier. It was perceived largely as students as being unclear as to what they can expect per the expectations. And there was a lot of trepidation about taking the comprehensive exam. And these interviews were actually done before the students had taken the comprehensive exam. So when we do the second round of interviews, we'll actually know the final results because they will have taken it for the first time. And then also for folks that had to take it a second time, we'll also know their results. So we'll actually have interviews with people that potentially are mastering out of the program. Another big question for us is trying to understand, were we actually managing to build community amongst the graduate students with the faculty and with each other, as well as building their identity with the program? So again, we found that our orientation, which has been led by Dr. Claudia DeGrandi, was incredibly influential in building community amongst classmates. We also found that students felt that the mentorship policy, so the meeting with their committees early on, was also important with helping integrate them into the program. And I should mention too, that part of the policies we have is that when students meet with their eventual dissertation committee, the PI actually leaves the meeting at some point so the student can talk to people without their PI there. Because a big part of our program has been network mentoring. So thinking about how we have multiple mentors in multiple places and trying to reduce the overall control that a PI has over the career of a student. One of the things that was actually pretty surprising and tough for the students in the first cohort, though, was the attitude that they all had towards the coursework. So even though they had become friends and they did a lot of stuff together that was not physics oriented, so in Utah here, camping, hiking, these kinds of things are very, very popular. And the students actually would oftentimes engage in these activities together. I mean, even when I was recruiting students and was taking the first cohort out to dinner, this is not part of the study, this is just my anecdote. The only thing they would basically talk about was their camping trips they took together. So we did manage building a communal cohort in that regards, but this same attitude per these 6 interviewees did actually not translate to the coursework. So they found that there wasn't a lot of working together. They would ask each other questions, but they weren't doing study sessions necessarily. And they actually described the coursework as being competitive. And this, of course, was, I don't think, the intention of the framers of this new program, firstly. And then secondly, our qualifying exam is not stratified. So it's not like half pass and half fail, which historically that has been true in some PhD programs across STEM. So there is no incentive for the students to be competitive or not work together because the only person they're competing against is themselves. And then the last thing we really wanted to look at with the students was what kind of support were the students having access to. So the Ombuds committee actually was incredibly helpful for the students that we interviewed. There were some concerns about particular faculty interaction. So the Ombuds community was a way that they actually had an anonymous route to talk about this with the department. They knew about the advisory meeting that was coming up, but they were uncertain about how helpful it will be. I think one of the concerns, and this was an intentionally set up, was that the advisory meeting is before the qualifying exam, or excuse me, the comprehensive exam. And that, you know, the comprehensive exam has such an impact on students' experiences that they go into the advisory meeting and they're holding this anxiety and uncertainty about the comprehensive exam that is being pretty tough. And then there was a lot of outside of the department support. So we heard a lot about partners, student clubs, and then pets. Pets were a very popular discussion piece for our students. So the other part of the study was looking at the graduate program change. So we're really looking at the process of change. Whereas in the first part of the study, we want to look at the student experiences and the policies. In this part of the study, we want to look at how did the change actually come about? How are we making it sustainable? And then how is it something that could possibly be translated to other departments that want to make change? So how did the change actually come about? So largely they were made by a select team of stakeholders, but these stakeholders would regularly meet together to discuss the changes in an iterative style. And then they did continually seek feedback from faculty meetings, advisory board, to the administration, and a little bit from students as well. The meetings were really crucial. So this was something that did not happen per the people we interviewed via email correspondence. It was largely happening in person. and junior faculty were reassigned away from these decisions and gave feedback in other ways. The junior faculty were not perceived as being shut out of the process, they were perceived as being protected from the process. There seemed to be concern that backlash could happen against junior faculty, but junior faculty were still involved in informing the decisions that were being made. And a lot of decisions were made per the interviews by looking at peer institutions, national programs, coupled with personal experiences in the context of our own program. Because the reality is with education, and us physics education researchers know this, is context heavily does matter. In all, we invited 54 people to participate in the study, which included every tenure line and tenured faculty in the department. We had a 50% response rate with 27 people sitting down for interviews that ranged in length from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. So they were actually quite long interviews. And from what Dr. Lenz has said, the postdoctoral scholar in the physics education research group here, folks were very chatty and very open, very candid about their experiences from Dr. Lenz's perspective, which was great. So what was the departmental reaction to these changes? So by and large, the folks that we interviewed talked about that they were mostly viewed favorably. There was some vocal pushback, but interestingly enough, and kind of obviously, all the people we interviewed were all very supportive of the changes. There was no one that we interviewed that was actually against them. So it's unclear, if the vocal pushback that's being talked about, it's probably delimited to one or two people in the department, and these were people that chose not to participate in this study. There was a lot of disagreement pretty across the board about the closing of the graduate program. It was felt strongly by the faculty that this hurt the wrong people. So in particular, it was perceived by the people that were interviewed that it did great harm to junior faculty because it cut off junior faculty from having new students coming into the program. It's also had ripple effects in the department. So this is a little bit beyond the research, but we have a lack of teaching assistants because of this. And we were already really understaffed when it came to graduate students. We're a faculty of 34. We're trying to build up to be a faculty of 40. And we don't even really have a ratio of 2 to 1 graduate students per faculty member. And as a faculty member that's recruiting graduate students, this is a real thing in the department. There's a bit of ambivalence, though, across the board in the interviews to changing the culture. So all of the changes that were conducted were perceived as being changes to the policies. And I think you can see that we did clearly change the policies. But the folks that were interviewed actually were more ambivalent to the changing of the culture. So there was less interest in trying to change the culture. And we'll talk about some of the fault lines of the department that still remain. And my understanding is that folks did not really look at this negatively. They were actually just less interested in the cultural change and more interested in having the policies in place to support students. And we're now at a point where these policies are going to be tested. So it's going to be interesting to see how they work. And then, of course, I think one of the big things that we always want to know about is what challenges were presented that obstructed the change. And it was largely perceived that a lot of the resistance from faculty basically came from the mindset of what we do is fine, and this is how it's done, and this is how it always should be. So these were the attitudes of the department, but obviously tragedy struck in other issues. I mean, we had students in the department that had been here for over 10 years, right? And that does not make for a healthy graduate program. The changes also largely weren't seen as being urgent. So a lot of people thought that the changes could be done more slowly, but because the graduate program was shut down and other external factors, there really was no way to do this. It's also worth mentioning that there also was media attention to the department. So the Salt Lake Tribune actually ran an article on our department, which hasn't really come up in the conversations, but my perspective is that probably caused an impact. And the team that I'm working with doing the research, primarily Dr. Lenz, were using that Salt Lake Tribune article and these other documents that came out of this process as research artifacts to look at as we try to understand this. And one of the big challenges was the general time constraint, because all of these changes were made very quickly in a short amount of time. And they were major changes. I mean, you're changing the comprehensive exam, the mentoring structure, the course structure. I was very lucky when I came in because all these changes had just happened. So it was very easy for me to add in a PER program, a physics education research program, which as a new faculty was actually very convenient and was one of the attractive features of the department, because the department really does have this very interdisciplinary bend, since we do have these 4 tracks in the department, which, if you're curious, they're physics, biophysics, astrophysics, and physics education research. So those are the 4 tracks in the department. But kind of unsurprisingly, change is hard, right? And it requires consensus. And consensus was built, unfortunately, through tragedy, but also the pressing need of students that were really falling through the cracks. Even with all these changes, though, there's still a lot of concerns with the program milestones. All of these results are preliminary, though. We only have 6 interviews, and we really need to interview the students again and interview the second cohort to get a better idea of what's going on. Of course, the pandemic has thrown everything into even further chaos. And this further data will, I think, really help illuminate this. So largely the policies that were enacted to support students have had a substantial impact, but cultural issues remain in the department. So we fixed the policies, the culture is not fixed. And there's overall a sense that faculty are out for themselves and people that are like them. So this is not necessarily a malicious thing. It's not that faculty are saying, hey, I don't want people, I'm in this field and I don't want this field to succeed. It's just that the structure of the department is set up in such a way that people are siloed into their research groups. They don't talk to one another, and they're really just focused on how they can accumulate resources for whatever they're doing rather than thinking about resources for the common good of the department, which has led to issues of poor communication and this continuation of department factions and cliques in the department, which are not very helpful for building a cohesive research community. And that really sums up everything that we have done so far with the research. We're working on the publications in January. Hopefully we'll submit those probably by March and get those going. Otherwise, we're happy to hear your questions. So thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Well, thank you both for going over all the changes thus far at Utah. We do have quite a few questions, so we'll get started with that. First question is whether this departmental review and the overhaul of the graduate program, has it caused any changes for the undergraduate side of things in the department?
Yeah, definitely. So probably the biggest impact on the undergraduate program so far is the TA development and training, because TAs have a lot of face time with undergraduate students, and how your TAs interact with undergraduates can really determine an undergraduate's experience in a lot of ways. So that's one thing, and so we've built in sort of inclusive teaching practice training and things like that, so that the graduate TAs are prepared for those classroom experiences. We had been sort of modifying our undergraduate program and updating it in small steps for the past 5 years, I would say. But we recently have undertaken, we stood up a committee and we've undertaken like a pretty extensive change to our undergraduate program, and Ramón is deeply involved with that. So I don't know if you want to say any more about it, Ramón.
Yeah, we're redoing the undergraduate program in a similar way to how the graduate program was being redone. We're going to the very basics actually, and we're redoing the entire 4-year path. And we're trying to set it up so that students can start in algebra and complete a 4-year degree in physics, which I think, as all of us know, is very challenging because that creates a bigger on-ramp time to the physics coursework. And we're also right now in the throes of trying to develop intermediate level physics classes. So we all know that we have standard intro level physics classes in every department, standard upper division classes, but there's this gap that people have to jump from going, from basic mechanics to Lagrangian mechanics. And we're trying to fill in that gap a little bit and drawing on other models across the country. So Oregon State's paradigms model is one that we're looking closely at as we rebuild the program. So there's a lot of attention going to the undergraduate program.
Great. And our next question will be about, for enforcing the timeline, you discussed a bunch of things about different research areas having different timeline things. How is the rate of progress for different research areas accounted for?
Yeah, so this is something, so and there's another question about our exam structure. So I'm going to kind of answer both of those together. So the exam structure right now is that there are really 2 core courses that students take in their very first semester of graduate school. And so our comprehensive exam, which is our written exam that's administered in the end of the first semester, is essentially the final exam for those 2 classes. So it's administered during the final exam period for those 2 classes. We know that all of our first years are enrolled in that. All tracks have the same comprehensive exam, that written exam after the first semester. However, there's an oral qualifying exam that happens later in a student's career, and that has to be completed by the end of the 5th semester. The oral qualifying exam, now students are in different research groups, and the expectations for those research groups are a little bit different. And this is laid out in the graduate handbook as well. So in some research subfields, it's expected that a student would give a summary of their first published research paper. And that's for fields where they would get started in actual research a little bit earlier. In other research fields, it could be a proposal for a research project. In other research fields, it could be a literature review, or essentially like the introduction chapter to their thesis. So that's the point where it's accounted for. We wanted to keep the timeline the same for everyone so that they have a chance to gracefully exit if that's the point where they decide that a master's degree is maybe a better path for them than a PhD. But we also wanted to be able to, to have some flexibility for different fields, because it is the rate of progress is different.
Great, thanks. So somebody also wanted to know, do you have any words of wisdom or preliminary advice about implementing cultural change?
Ooh, so cultural change is the hardest part of all of this. And it wasn't much in my timeline, because it's something that we, it's a constant thing. And we've gone through periods where we tried to undertake cultural change in different ways. It is the hardest part. My advice is to talk about it all the time, even when it's awkward. I think the periods where we've made the most progress are periods where we had those difficult discussions, and maybe everybody didn't want to have those discussions. The other thing that's difficult about those discussions is that everybody is starting in different places. So some people have been thinking about, issues related to representation in physics, for example. Some people have been thinking about that for a long time, and other people have never thought about it before. And so finding a way to have those discussions together in a productive way. We're very lucky at the University of Utah to have some people who are supportive of this in our Center for Inclusive Excellence. I'll give a shout out to Liz Bond-Rogers, who's an excellent facilitator and really makes sure that we can have these conversations in ways that everybody's voices are heard.
I'll actually, if you don't mind, Alexis, I'll jump in and just answer a few quick shot questions in a row. So my understanding is that there was no discussion about eliminating the comprehensive exam. And my understanding is that the graduate college essentially required us to have some version of a comprehensive exam. I think following the interviews with the students that are going to be upcoming in January, we'll be able to have that conversation again, because we'll have a better idea of how two cohorts had experienced the comprehensive exam. And I think that'll inform that conversation. Right now, it's what stands. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Pearl.
No, I think that's great. So there was actually discussion about this. However, we were not in a position where that was something that our department was going to broadly accept. The situation may be different now, but people had been very attached to their ideas of what a traditional, written exam is. And so we weren't in a position to do that. There were some things that were easier to get consensus on, and some things that were more difficult to get consensus on. And we really did need consensus in order to make sure that these things were successful. So there was discussion of it, but we weren't in a position to do that. Things that we also wanted to sort of, you have to choose your battles in some sense. We were doing a lot of changes at the same time. And so things that we were successful with were like eliminating the physics GRE as a requirement, like that kind of stuff that was easier for people to swallow, I think, because there was research that supported it. And so I think the research that Ramón is leading is going to be really important to having a better discussion about the comprehensive exam.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not even comfortable right now even trying to assess the comprehensive exam, because we really need to see it go through the full motion for the first cohort, and then we'll see it go through half the motion for the second cohort, because students do have the ability to retake it the second year if they don't do well the first year. So they do have that option. And we did have students the majority of students did pass, I can share that, but there were a few students that either passed one part or not the other part, because there's two parts, E&M and quantum. So they're going through it again. So it'll be interesting to see their experiences, and we're keeping track of that. I actually don't think that there was any bias in who participated in the study based on interest in PER. We had representatives from every single research group that participated in the study, and we had representatives at every single level within the department. So I actually don't think that was impacted. Yeah, Alexis, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. So in case everyone was wondering, Ramón was going through some of the questions in the Q&A. I know it can be a little spotty if you don't read the Q&A along. So anyway, there's some questions about equity matters in this. Could you either of you speak to this about the success of equity goals? And so far in the changes, as well as how are you supporting students who may be who are marginalized?
Do you want me to go first? So you know the numbers better than I do. I think our gender balance has improved substantially under the new program, at least for the first cohort. It's not, I mean, we're still dealing with small number statistics, but our application review process, you know, it seems better to me. That's an extremely unscientific way of saying it. So we'll have to wait for the like actually to have a sizable number of things sizable number of cases to evaluate. There was one hurdle that we encountered in our first round of, so part of going to a holistic application review process is making it clear to applicants what's being evaluated. And so we redesigned our prompts. Instead of having a generic personal statement, we had specific prompts that we, you know, wanted to solicit the information that we wanted to evaluate from applicants. However, in our first application review round, we found that international students were not understanding the prompts in the same ways that domestic students were understanding the prompts. And so it led to a real disparity in how generally how international candidates were evaluated versus how domestic candidates were evaluated. So we fixed that hopefully for the next round of application review. But these things are all kind of works in progress because there's not any like best practice guide, like just do this and it'll work out well. So you kind of just have to jump and see if it works. So I think, you know, I think that's working out pretty well. As far as supports once they're in the program, like making sure that our Graduate Student Advisory Council is a well-functioning group is really important. And also that there's representation on the Graduate Student Advisory Council, which in the past had been an issue for us that we've been addressing, you know, for several years, but I think we're in a pretty good place on that. We also have a group for women in physics and astronomy, and our interactions with like, you know, our SACNAS chapter, and there are other groups across campus that are really important that we've, you know, I think it's more clear now how we're all working together, and students are encouraged to sort of seek out those opportunities. Ramon, do you want to say more about that?
I would say that I think we're very sensitive to student issues now. I've dealt with a couple myself, and we're well connected with the other constituents on campus as far as resources, the financial center, the mental wellness center, the disabilities center. And we triage students oftentimes to these different pathways, and we have a good communication with the various associate chairs and faculty when these issues come up. We're not doing well on racial and ethnic diversity as well as LGBT people. I think we can very safely say that. Part of that, unfortunately, is the function of Utah. I think that I know for a fact that I have people of color that are concerned about coming to Salt Lake City, and that's a completely reasonable concern, and they should have that concern because this is a place that does not have diversity and has a lot of issues, as most places in the United States do. But we're working on it, right? And we're trying to make change. And one way that we're doing that is through our REU program. So we invite a lot of people from SACNAS, NSVP, NSHP to be a part of our REU program. As far as there's questions about the tenure process and the tracks in the chat box. I'll let Pearl handle those. I'll answer the one about the 4 tracks in the department. So there's 4 tracks, like I said: bio, astro, ed, physics education, and then physics. They all result in a PhD that says physics. But each one of them, all of them require quantum and E&M as the first 2 classes. So the cohort comes in together through training in the summer, 2 weeks together every day. They then take these 2 courses together. They can study together. They're not competitive. There's no like only half pass. You're competing against yourself, and that's it. And then in the second semester, people diversify. So like I know the physics ed track the best. In the second semester, students take StatMech, and then they take a PER class. And then in the second year, they take education classes and then advanced physics classes if it's appropriate for their dissertation topic. In biophysics, they take StatMech in a bio class, and then in astrophysics, they take radiative processes and then astrophysics classes. So the first semester is the same for everybody. And then after that, people diversify into their separate tracks. Biology takes biology courses. Astro, it's all in-house. And then I'm largely sending my students actually to sociology now to take their courses because we don't have the faculty to in-house them yet.
Okay, so there's a question here about faculty hiring processes or the tenure process. Have these things changed as a sort of in concert with the changes to the grad program? And the answer is yes. So we've sort of been working on faculty hiring to have more more equitable hiring practices and more transparent hiring practices. And this, it's been a work in progress for the last few years. I wrote up some guidelines when I was associate chair of our department that were implemented on search committees for the last few years. And that includes things like now people have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement as part of their application packet, as well as training on how to evaluate those, which is something that is now implemented across the College of Science as of this year. This is not something that our upper administration has implemented yet, so it's something that was being pioneered in the College of Science, and we're pretty excited to see how that's happening. It's been really interesting. There is support for training on things like how to evaluate teaching and diversity statements, but there's not any university-wide sort of mandate for including those pieces of the application packet. But there has been an attention and changed policies to make sort of these things that will go in the direction of changing culture, to make that an accepted part of being a faculty member. This is part of our jobs, is to understand these issues and be conversant in them and to support our students in this way. There is a question for me about about balancing research with program overhaul. And that is a huge challenge. So I will say that during the primary period of the grad program overhaul, I was associate chair of our department, which meant that I had a partial administrative appointment. So it was sort of part of my job. That was like my service contribution, essentially. That said, it was a lot of work. So, it's a difficult path. I think you have to pick and choose very carefully. But ultimately, for me, the decision came down to, I want to help my department be the type of place that I'm going to be proud to be a part of. And, when we had a whole bunch of faculty who were willing to do that, then it was time to do that work.
And we have time for one last question because I want to be mindful. We will end. And I understand there are a lot of amazing questions that are just rolling in. If I plan on staying on after, I don't know if Ramon or Pearl can, but if we want to talk further through some of this stuff. The last question I'll go with is, what role have grad students played within the admissions retention process, and are the grad students having upper level grad student advisors? So I think they're asking about mentoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so graduate student to graduate student mentoring is something that has happened through GSAC, our graduate student group, when it's happened. And we sort of decided not to manage that ourselves. We decided that the thing that we could do was make sure that graduate students had strong relationships, and then hope that it evolves sort of organically. Graduate students play a role in faculty retention. So the Graduate Student Advisory Council, actually, their primary role on campus, in each department on campus, is that they interview and evaluate faculty in every formal faculty review. So tenure and promotion reviews and other formal reviews. So they're kind of used to having a voice there. I think one improvement is that we've started having more frequent graduate student town halls that are led by GSAC, and that department leadership is, the graduate program committee, as well as the chair and associate chair, are involved in those discussions. Graduate students are not involved in the admissions process themselves, though. We don't have a graduate student on the admissions committee. But that's an interesting idea.
Great, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I thank Pearl and Ramon for this wonderful conversation today. Again, I will be staying on till people leave, or you're welcome to leave. We will stop recording now. I don't have controls over that. So if Janet could do that, that'd be awesome. Thank you. And please stay tuned for the winter spring webinars.